This is Duke University.
Well, thanks, Giovanni. And I want to thank Giovanni not only for organizing this, but for all of his hard work on behalf of the Center for International Studies for organizing tonight's event, and for Chris's week-long visit, which has been extremely rich and has provided a number of perspectives. And in many ways is a metaphor, or a microcosm perhaps, of a wide range of scholarship that is represented in his work. I also, as I was sort of jotting down a few thoughts about how in the world I was going to introduce Professor Bailey, I realized that in fact it was possible that Giovanni had actually invited me to give tonight's featured lecture, British, Indian, and Global History in the Shadow of Chris Bailey. It is with great honor and even more humility that I accept this charge and this invitation. I will speak for 45 minutes and then I will take questions. The daunting task, of course, of introducing tonight's guest of honor for the 2015 John Richards Memorial Lecture in Comparative Global History. As I remarked at an event earlier this week on Sunday, it is truly a challenge to introduce somebody who genuinely needs no introduction. Educated at Oxford and Cambridge, and been at Cambridge since 1970, Professor Sir Christopher Allen Bailey is Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History Emeritus at Cambridge, Professor of History at Queen Mary, University of London, and for 2014-2015, the Vivekananda Professor at the University of Chicago. Recipient of the Wolfson Prize in 2005 and knighted in 2007. To list any more of Professor Bailey's honors in recognition of his service to the history profession would truly take an entirely separate event in itself. Professor Bailey is the author, co-author or editor of well over a dozen books, as well as countless articles and other contributions. He has written widely and influentially on the history of colonial India, something that most people in this room need no introduction to as well. In this work, including The Local Roots of Indian Politics, Allahabad, 1880 to 1920, in 1975, Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars in 1983, and his 1988 volume in the New Cambridge History of India, Indian Society and the Making of the British Empire, he revealed the active and complex role South Asians, and particularly indigenous merchant, banking, and business communities played in shaping the political economy of early colonial rule. On a personal note, I needed to observe that, and I couldn't let this moment pass without mentioning something I haven't mentioned to you before, that my first ever undergraduate paper in South Asian history was a profound and probing 5-page analysis of Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars. A work which I believe set me on my path to stand here today. So I hope we can forgive that one black mark in an otherwise impeccable curriculum vitae. Much like the historian whose memory we honor tonight, Professor Richards, Professor Bailey could not be satisfied with transforming the ways in which we thought about early colonial Indian history, but soon began to turn his attention to the making of world history itself. His Imperial Meridian in 1989 reframed the very chronologies and narratives of the birth of the so-called Second British Empire. Moreover, in this book's emphasis on the shared early modern moment between Europe and Asia and its interest in the imperial and global histories that set them on paths towards perhaps convergent and in other sense divergent histories and futures, one can see a foreshadowing of his magisterial 2004, The Birth of the Modern World, Global Connections and Comparisons. If Imperial Meridian set out to explain modern empire, Birth of the Modern World explored in sweeping fashion the roots of both the rise of modernity and as well as the deep histories and presence of globalization, a subject he continues to explore in his forthcoming Remaking of the Modern World, which we've had opportunity of discussing this week here at Duke. In the same 2 decades, as if that wasn't enough, Professor Bailey published works, among others, on spies and intelligence networks in colonial India, the origins of nationalism in modern South Asia, the rise of Indian brands of liberal thought in the context of a global intellectual history of the 19th century, and with Tim Harper, Forgotten Armies and Forgotten Wars, 2 breathtaking tomes which reconceptualized the way in which Asia experienced both World War II and the waves of anti-colonial and decolonial struggles that followed. Earlier this week, Professor Bailey suggested in a seminar that perhaps the greatest challenge of writing global history is not just what to put in, but what you have to leave out. I am taking up his charge and almost certainly leaving out as many accomplishments as I have included here. So let me just conclude my own minute on Chris Bailey in the spirit of the subject of tonight's lecture. Whether treating subjects ranging from political and economic to intellectual history, or from the deepest sinews of local histories of commercial life to the bird's eye view of the globe, I hope it will not be considered in too poor taste if I say, paraphrasing and hopefully corrupting beyond recognition, Thomas Babington Macaulay's possibly most infamous remark in his 1835 Minute on Education, which I presume we'll hear more about tonight, when I say, I think no one would deny that a single shelf of Professor Bailey's library of work might well be worth the whole of many, many historiographies with which it has engaged. With that in mind, to misquote Macaulay once more, it is with zeal and alacrity that I hope you will join me in welcoming Professor Bailey and in eagerly awaiting his own thoughts on Indian thought and the shadow of Macaulay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. I don't think I can even begin to thank you for a wonderful week, and many others, including Giovanni, have helped greatly to produce a tremendous debate and discourse. And of course, in a way, Macaulay was one of the most aggressive, discursive thinkers of the 19th century. So I'm greatly honored to be giving the 215 John Richards Memorial Lecture here at Duke University. John was a great friend of mine from the early 1970s. Over many years, I collaborated with him and with Gordon Johnson as editor of the New Cambridge History of India. John's own volume in the series was perhaps the best, combining readability, a strong argument, and a deep knowledge of Persian and Urdu. And it's to the issue of language that I want to turn today, not in John's Mughal period, but in the 19th and 20th century when Persian, but for a brief resurgence, to which I'll refer later, became a scholarly rather than a popular form of communication, and the many vestiges of the Mughal culture were swept away. At the same time, I'm delighted to recognize the warm welcome I've received here from my colleagues, particularly Phil, as I said, whose work I've admired for many years, Giovanni Zanalda, who's put up with an endless flow of emails and attachments from me, and with whom I share a great interest in economic history. I've enjoyed talking to Engsing Ho about global history. Finally, it's been a pleasure to talk to Sumati Ramaswamy, whose book, Passions of the Tongue, I regard as the best historical study of modern Indian language available. I'll be talking about both the reasons and also the passions of the tongue as reflected in the relationship and conflict between English and Indian languages, particularly Hindi. Here, a target both of praise and also of denunciation has been Thomas Babington Macaulay, historian and author of The Minute on Education of 1835, which supposedly marginalized Persian and Sanskrit. Relatively few British historical figures from the early 19th century continue to receive the attention of historians and popular biographers, compared with the famous names of the 20th century. There are, of course, the bugle and drum styles of histories of Wellington, studies of Darwin and the Mills, and royalist works on Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Macaulay, hardly a romantic figure, continues, however, to receive the attention of scholars and popular biographies. At least 10 biographies and popular historical works on Macaulay have appeared since the 1950s. Among these, John Clive's 1973 biography was a monument of detailed literary and historical reconstruction, while the popular historian Arthur Bryant devoted one of his final books to Macaulay in 1979. More recently yet, Robert E. Sullivan's Macaulay, The Tragedy of Power, received both praise and opprobrium because of its portrayal of him as an aggressive liberal imperialist. Then, a mere 18 months ago, Zahir Masani's Macaulay, Britain's Liberal Imperialist, was released. This seems strange at a time when Macaulay's sonorous prose seems so antiquated in the days of Facebook and blog, when historians have shredded his progressive Whig views of British history with Marxist, then post-structural, and finally post-colonialist arguments, and when the British Raj has lost any interest for most citizens in both Britain and India. Yet there are two issues on which historians and polemicists continue to return to the case of Macaulay: the 1835 Minute on Education and the promotion of English languages in India, on the one hand, and Macaulay's support for what is now called humanitarian intervention in other states and societies, ostensibly to promote progress, on the other. Sullivan's study was particularly idiosyncratic as a version of the latter. Full and quite novel in its description of Macaulay's youth and upbringing, it went on to forge a rather dubious teleology of imperial aggression, which linked Macaulay and his support of the Opium War against China to the new imperialism of the later 19th century, and even to General Westmoreland's American disasters in Vietnam in the 1960s. This annoyed patriotic British historians. Andrew Roberts, for instance, denounced Sullivan for portraying Macaulay as a hypocritical monster who appeared to prepare the path for Nazism. On the issue of English in India, there's also been a continuous, if somewhat less heated controversy, which will be the main subject of my lecture. Masani's book is quite unabashed in portraying Macaulay as the father of Indian modernity. One of my Indian colleagues remarked about this, "Oh, we Indians don't mind Parsis making arguments like this, but we'd become enraged if a Britisher did so." At the book's launch, which I attended, Mark Tully took an opposite view, casting Macaulay as the creator of an incubus which impeded Indians from developing their own vernaculars and helped split its society along the lines of caste and status, a popularized version of Homi Bhabha's colonial epistemic violence. And it's quite interesting that a piece very recently in the New York Times is entitled "How English Ruined Indian Literature." On the issue of English in India, there's also been a continuing, if somewhat less heated controversy. And I want to say about this that it all makes it particularly important to distinguish between Macaulay as a legislator and Macaulay as a generator of social change. One of the main points about Macaulay's Minute on Education is that it didn't unequivocally disadvantage Sanskrit and Persian, let alone Indian vernaculars, to the advantage of English, nor did it initiate a great expansion of the use of English in the subcontinent. That was well underway before Macaulay set foot in Calcutta, to his rapid disenchantment. In Western India, for instance, Parsi merchants working alongside British firms alternated between their native Gujarati and English, depending on the context. Mount Stuart Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay in the 1820s, and a body of mainly Scottish military and civil officers implanted new educational and civic institutions in the city, while simultaneously imposing British rule on the interior of Western India. The Bombay Literary Society soon spawned a Bombay Native Literary Society. Elphinstone College, as it became, was a forcing house for modern forms of education, particularly statistics and political economy, diffusing the use of English amongst the local elites and subordinate administrators. In Bengal, where Macaulay penned his Minute, Dubashes, commercial agents commanding two languages, Dobasha, were using English 50 or more years before 1835. Even in terms of publicity and the seeking the attention of the government, it was Bengali religious and social reformers, particularly Ram Mohan Roy, who were the first to disparage the policy of Orientalist officials who spent government money on teaching Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Roy established the Brahminical magazine, an English publication to propagate social and religious reform in 1821. In 1822, he founded the Anglo-Hindu School, which taught partially in English. Roy also urged the Governor-General, Lord Harmsworth, to expand English education. In a book published in 1990, at the time of the liberalization of the Indian economy, Poonam Upadhyaya linked Ram Mohan Roy more directly to Macaulay. She states that Macaulay almost certainly knew of Ram Mohan's letter to Amherst. Macaulay's Minute speaks derisively of Sanskrit education, creating such persons as might have studied in the sacred books of the Hindus all the uses of kausa grass and all the mysteries of the absorption into the deity. According to Upadhyay, the Minute as a whole is an elaboration of Ram Mohan's letter in Macaulayan rhetoric. She also suggests that Macaulay seems to have appropriated Ram Mohan's notion of the value of the diffusion of European learning, which he presented in his, quote, Remarks on Settlement in India by Europeans, appended to the 1832 report of the Parliamentary Select Committee on East India Affairs. Upadhyay's book has been somewhat overshadowed by more recent work by Lynn Zastupil and Bruce Carlyle Robertson on Ram Mohan, but there's no question that on this matter, both Ram Mohan and Macaulay were echoing the broader discourse of the so-called global age of reform between 1815 and 1848. What has kept the Minute in the public eye in Britain and India is therefore not so much its novelty or its immediate social consequences, as much as rhetorical vigor, sarcasm, and its global historical and political scope. It's been minutely analysed, quite apart from the productive debate about the influence on it of Ram Mohan or Bentinck. Much of the debate has centered on Macaulay's insults to Indian culture and the Hindu religion, in particular, the shelf of Western books being worth more than the whole of Indian literature, creating a class of Indians, English in language and sensibility. His belief that Hindu religion would succumb to Christianity, which arose from a misreading of contemporary Indian movements of religious and social reform, such as Ramohan's own Brahma Samaj. Writing in 1992, Sara Soleri contrasted Macaulay's cultural blindness with Burke's apologia for Indian civilization made at the trial of Warren Hastings for corruption and oppression 50 years earlier. She concluded, however, that both Burke and Macaulay were concealing deeper fears about the seductive effects of Indian civilization's capacity to absorb and transform young Britons, or even Britain as a whole. Post-colonial theorists working in the line of Derrida, notably Bhabha himself, have also descanted on the manner in which Macaulay's minute represented the formation of fractured subjectivities, sly hybridity, and this disempowerment of the subalterns by insinuating that knowledge could only be imparted through a specific language and through specific forms of civility. Yet even Macaulay's purblind rhetoric contains some interesting tropes. First, his attack on Hinduism is clearly linked genealogically to James Mill's earlier assault on the irrationality of the Hindus, which was fiercely rebutted by British Indian officers of an Orientalist cast of mind. Secondly, Macaulay's dismissive references to the uses of kusa grass, kusa, the primeval vegetal substance of life in the classic Sanskrit texts, contrasts with his later admiring remarks about Jenner's discovery of the vaccine against smallpox. This was, after all, a period when progressive scientific medicine was banishing herbal folk medicine across the UK, a process only slowly reversed as homeopathy began to spread in the later 19th century. Again, the derisory reference to Hindu deities 500 feet tall reminds us of the global demystification of myth and legend following the appropriation of Enlightenment rationalism during the 19th century. Even later Hindu nationalist writers, such as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who tried to prove that the god Krishna was a historical figure like King Alfred, represents this change. The statement in the Puranas, according to Chatterjee, that he'd fathered 150,000 sons, Bankim said, was clearly nonsense, because this would have meant fathering 7 sons for every day of his productive life, leaving very little time for nation building. Mention of Alfred also draws attention to the use of the Anglo-Saxon past in the minute, and indeed in Macaulay's other writings. The Anglo-Saxons and Celts, Macaulay believed, needed to be tutored by Roman knowledge and Latin language, just as Indians needed to be released from the backwardness of their own language by Latin. This obvious paternalism raises an important question. For Macaulay hoped that English would improve Indian vernaculars, or dialects as he called them, but not destroy them, as many commentators have asserted. His target was an overemphasis on Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic, just as some of his contemporaries were beginning to critique an overemphasis on Latin and Greek in British schooling, most particularly at the East India College at Haileybury. Even on this issue, the minute specifically said that Arabic would continue to be taught in the Delhi Madrasa and Sanskrit at the Benares College, even though the admission of new students in the classical languages was to be discontinued in Calcutta and Agra. Macaulay even proposed that 2 learned Hindus should be appointed to the Governor-General's Education Committee, and he worried that Muslims were not yet represented. This project, the seeding of Indian languages with the special knowledges imparted by English, was not therefore opposed by the proponents of major Indian vernaculars as they developed rapidly in the mid to late 19th century, as I'll mention later. In fact, facing the scorn of post-colonialist writers, Macaulay seems to have become the victim of his own sarcastic rhetoric. One could also add, mischievously, I'm afraid, that a large proportion of those who denounce him may themselves be, quote, Indians in blood and color, but English or now American in tastes, manners, and opinions. Their anger perhaps conceals a sense of embarrassment that Macaulay had the last laugh. Yet, for Macaulay, language alone was not in itself enough to foster modernity. The Anglo-Saxon language, inflected with Latin, had not been sufficient to bring about the development of modern Britain. The dominance of the Normans and their governmentality, as we would now say, had also been essential. These forces together would eventually create a realm which combined English liberty with Norman justice. Similarly, India needed British government for a generation or more, though not necessarily forever. This deep historicism was typical of the 19th century, but it could be contested from within. The historian E.A. Freeman, for instance, took a benign view of Saxon democracy and deplored Norman tyranny. In India, Ram Mohan Roy also conceded that India needed providential British rule for a time, while on the contrary, writers of the later 19th century, such as Ferozi Shah Mehta and K.T. Telang, argued that the pre-colonial Maratha kingdoms were closer to the people, fostered what we would now call social mobility, and were less extractive than the East India Company's despotism. There's one other important dimension of the minute which has received little attention. That is the manner in which it reflected a particular global moment of supposed reform, progress, and colonization in the 1830s and 40s. It's no accident that Macaulay introduced the analogy of the Pasha of Egypt when discussing educational reform in India. Where would Egypt be, he asked, if its ruler had insisted on the use of hieroglyphics and instruction in all the doctrines disguised under the fable of Osiris, and to ascertain the ritual with which cats and onions were anciently adored? Of course, Macaulay's sneering disguised the fact that there was little or no continuity between the worship of Osiris in pharaonic Egypt and Mehmet Ali's reformed Muslim Egypt of the 1820s and 30s. By contrast, there were some clear continuities in belief and practice between the Vedas and modern Hinduism. Yet Macaulay was evidently aware of the Egyptian ruler's attempts to modernize his country on a Napoleonic model. British officials were also aware of the changes in the Ottoman Empire, which would shortly culminate in the Tanzimat reconstruction reforms of 1838 and after. In fact, a few years later, one of them, British officials that is, called for the introduction of Turkish officials in India, since they were decently modern, but at the same time closer to India's Muslims than Europeans. A second contemporary analogy to India's modernization for Macaulay was Russia, which had recently seen the Decembrist movement of progressive nobles and the first moves to reform the Tsar's autocracy and the serf-based land system. Yes, that's in the wrong order. That was Ram Mohan Roy. Here we are in Russia. Where would Russia be, Macaulay asked, if national prejudice had been pandered to and the heads of the young had been filled with old woman's stories and lying legends about St. Nicholas, or had been set to answer the question whether or not the world was created on the 13th of September? As it was, Russia, which he says was probably behind the Punjab in the time of our grandfathers, will be pressing close on France and Britain in the career of improvement by the time of our grandchildren. Macaulay was fascinated by the apparent pace of reform in Russia, now seen as a growing threat to the northwestern borders of British India. He wrote to Governor-General Bentinck recommending the taking of immediate measures for learning what the system of education in Russia now is. The third global context in which Macaulay set his challenges to educational conservatism in India related to the importance of English as the language of commerce throughout the seas of the East, as he put it. India was increasingly linked by trade, he said, to the two great European communities which are rising, the one in south of Africa and the other in Australia. Here again, the insight of Macaulay, the historian, overshadows the prejudice of Macaulay, the cultural bigot. The 1830s saw the emergence of the Australian colonies from the rule of authoritarian governors, the end of transportation, and the beginnings of the great boom in wool production as the Depression of 1829 ended, and the Indian armies were increasingly drawing in horses from Western Australia. The same decade saw the remarkably fast growth of Cape Town as an English-speaking city, while the British population of the Cape overtook the Dutch. Equally, the decade witnessed the emergence of Singapore as a great trading city from under the tutelage of Penang. This was soon followed by the exponential growth of Canton, on the back of opium and Indian raw cotton, as the East India Company's hold on the China trade was broken by the Reform Parliament and the Opium War hove into sight. Finally, Colombo began to flourish as its own exports of palm oil boomed when the Depression abated. In all these settlements, indigenous groups, as Macaulay implied, were already taking to English. Peranakan Chinese, the so-called Dutch burghers in Ceylon, and the Tamil and Bengali Indians who traded along the Malay coast communicated with each other and the colonial power in English. Subverting the common racial exclusion out of commercial necessity, Parsi and Gujarati merchants sat alongside British free traders on the boards of insurance companies, which emerged during this period to reduce the risks of the China trade. The role of the English language in India gradually expanded, subject to some controversies, which I'll discuss later. Its progress was aided and publicized, though not initiated by Macaulay's policies and rhetoric. His aim of seeding Indian vernacular languages with English knowledge dispensed by a small Western educated class could be seen in the same light. The standardization and simplification of Bengali was already underway by 1800, pressed forward first by missionaries seeking converts and later by Ram Mohan Roy and his co-workers. Hindi, which was once to become India's great national language, took longer to cohere. Francesca Orsini and Ashwaj Kumar have pointed to the great number of sub-languages in what came to be called the Hindi belt, as many as 11 on one count. As it emerged after about 1870, Standard Hindi, so-called Braj-Bhasha, was undoubtedly influenced by English language codification and grammatical structure. Ironically, Sanskrit played a part in this process, replacing Persian and Arabic borrowings over time. Yet the creators of this modern Hindi, Adhunik Hindi, such as the writer Bhartendu Harishchandra, here he is, of Benares, were by no means uniformly hostile to English at this period, even if they denounced colonial government in their Hindi newspapers. India had long been a multilingual society, and English served its purpose as the language of science, law, and regulation. Only later was Hindi annexed by a strong form of nationalism, though this ultimately also failed to displace English. To this extent, Macaulay won out, latterly aided by India's numerous Roman Catholic schools, Silicon Valley, and Bangalore. Another of Macaulay's intended progressive moves, the attempt to create a penal code for Indian law, however, had a less easy passage. Its origins lay once again in Britain's age of reform in the 1820s and 30s and the broad context of Bentham's utilitarianism. Indeed, Macaulay was first suggested as law member of the government of India by James Mill, at that time in the full flight of utilitarianism. The code was proposed as a rational ordering of types of crime and punishment, from murder to thefts and slander, so giving superior courts in India guidance in the classification of cases. The classes of crime were drawn from English common law, shorn of its local oddities and inconsistencies. Some aspects of the Code Napoleon and American legal documents also served as models for Macaulay's commission. Historians such as Javed Majid have moved away from the stricter utilitarian interpretation of the code proposed by Eric Stokes in the 1960s. All the same, it's a remarkable rational legal document to emerge from an English context and address many of the charges of malpractice and absurdity which onlookers such as William Sleeman noted in the judgments of Indian courts of that generation. True to form, Macaulay inveighed against what he took to be an authentic Indian code of justice, the classical laws of Manu or Manusmriti. He implied that the new code would serve the interests of the Shudras, the lower castes, as well as those of the Brahmins, bringing equality before the law to India's people. In fact, though, classical Hindu law had remarkably little purchase in early 19th century Indian legal practice, which was a mess of custom, loosely applied common law, and fragments of Mughal and Hindu law, which had been jumbled together from the time of Warren Hastings onwards. Macaulay's code was, of course, not implemented until the 1860s. Changes of Governor-General and the equivocation of the Court of Directors, and finally the Indian Mutiny Rebellion of 1857 put it on hold for a generation. But the long-term effects of his draftsmanship were considerable. Sniped at and criticized by British and Indian lawyers from the 1860s to the present day, diluted with doses of Sharia in Pakistan, it has nevertheless continued to serve as a template. This is not least because it was later introduced in a somewhat modified form in Malaya and British Southeast Asia. Tellingly, the most enthusiastic responses to the 150th anniversary of the final promulgation of the code in 2011 came not from Indians, but from Singapore, where Wing Chao Chow and his colleagues published a volume of essays considering it as a masterpiece. Tellingly again, Singapore, to a lesser extent Malaysia, have been the scene in recent years of controversies not about the use of English, as in India, but about the need to impose standard English on what has come to be called Singlish, Singapore English patois. The authority former Prime Minister, the late Lee Kuan Yew, had taken a role as proponent of English, demonstrating that liberal imperialism still had its uses right up to the present day. Macaulay died a short time before his code was implemented in India, and just as officials and scholarly opinion began to move in a more conservative direction in relation to indigenous language, tradition, and politics. I'll first examine the gradual percolation of the English language into Indian elite circles, and then move on to a controversy about English and indigenous education in the Punjab in the 1880s, in which Macaulay's name and policies were frequently invoked. One key audience for Anglicist policies were Western-educated Bengalis, and in particular members of the Brahmo Samaj of Ram Mohan Roy, or people influenced by them. In view of Roy's own advocacy of the modernizing power of English and his influence on Macaulay himself, this is not surprising. The tone was set by the Bengali writer Bholanath Chandra Ghosh, whose Travels of a Hindu to Various Parts of Bengal and Upper India, edited by Tallboys Wheeler, was published in 1869, though these travels had actually occurred a decade earlier. Bholanath Chandra intoned, "The value of Sanskrit is sentimental and literary, that of English utilitarian and political. Indian classics contain, I quote, no exposition of the principles on which are based Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, or the Habeas Corpus. One reads of no political martyrs, like Cato and Sidney. The distinction is between romance and bread. Romance is good, but bread is better." Here, though, one glimpses a degree of ambivalence which was common in Indian writers who wished to embrace English, but at the same time to reject Macaulay's and James Mill's violent verbal assaults on their culture. It was Sir William Jones, not Mill, who was right, Bholanath said, for modern Western civilization emerged from the East and was transmitted through Plato. The civilization of the ancient Hindus, he says, was the forerunner. The civilization of modern Europeans is that of the outrunner. The family of the second Bengali figure, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, also exemplifies the first attempts of the generation of the modern Indian patriot to meld English and classical learning. Dutt was one of the leading critics of India's colonial economy, what I call statistical liberals, who used British data and arguments against the Anglo-Indian bureaucracy. But he was also deeply immersed in literary studies, including, of course, Macaulay. In fact, in 1894, Dutt published The Lays of Ancient India in homage to Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. Ironically, his attempt was criticized for not being about glorious Indian political events, but mere legend. It contradicted the prevailing determination to historicize myth, which I mentioned. Dutt's family, however, had adjusted to both indigenous and English cultural traditions. Nimoni Dutt, his grandfather, remained a Hindu, but sheltered fugitive missionaries pursued by the East India Company in the 1810s. Nimoni's eldest son, quotes, a stern economist, was nevertheless secretary to the Calcutta Sanskrit College, Macaulay's bête noire, and yet he kept a massive collection of English books. Another relative, Govind Chanda, wrote English stories, while his daughter, Toru Dutt, translated from the French into Bengali. Ramesh himself learned English, and aged 11 or 12, had seen Macbeth, produced by British soldiers who'd been sent to suppress the 1857 rebellion. It's a remarkable thought. Every evening, he had literary discussions with his father on topics such as Lane's Arabian Nights and English poetry. Later, Dutt travelled to Britain, where he listened to J.S. Mill and Dilke and improved his Sanskrit under the tutelage of Goldstucker at University College London. It's important to give an indication of the mental life of these reformed Bengali intelligentsia families, because some literary scholars and historians have a tendency to see the development of the English literature and Western concepts in India as a form of epistemic violence. Indeed, reading many of Macaulay's own statements, this would seem to be a reasonable assumption. Certainly, colonial domination provided the context within which these developments took place. Many took to English mainly to secure government jobs, as the cynical Cambridge School of Indian History of the 1970s, to which I was associate, asserted. But here was also a study of appropriation and literary and cultural plurality. As Dutt put it, Bengali literature necessarily drew on English, and to improve it, a good knowledge of English literature was necessary, just as English drew on Latin and Italian during the period of its formation. This was a sentiment of which Macaulay, in an uncharacteristically temperate guise, might have approved. Dutt, therefore, rejected the proposal of the Bengal government of that period to withdraw funds from English education and concentrate them on education in Bengali. In addition, there was a nationalist message, quotes, "Forensic eloquence didn't develop itself only in English. Constitutional agitation and political work must be conducted in English," as it was at the time the only common Indian language. It was not the use of English itself, but the constant emphasis on English history, the superiority of English politics and morality, which constituted epistemic violence, according to Indian publicists. As in Native Opinion, a Bombay journal wrote in 1875, "India must be inserted into world history. The philosophers Bismarck and Bhaskacharya should stand alongside Socrates and George Washington." Macaulay's most persistent interlocutor was not, however, a Bengali, but Western India's leading statistical liberal, Dadabhai Naoroji, who went on to become MP for Finsbury, president of the Indian National Congress, and an inveterate critic of the British government of India. His classic Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, 1893, might well have irritated Macaulay, but the resolution passed by Naoroji's London creation, the East India Association, that English should become the national language of India, would presumably not have done so. Naoroji, of course, was a Parsi of Iranian and Zoroastrian origin, and Parsis generally tended to identify with the English language and Western ideology even more strongly than Bengali reformist Hindus. This wasn't surprising. The Parsis were far from their Persian roots and generally spoke Gujarati, a vernacular which developed more slowly than Bengali. Moving from small-town trading to the metropolis of Bombay, they became the international merchants working alongside British free traders across the Indian Ocean and the Chinese seas. English was a natural form of public communication for them. Equally, though, the Parsis' Zoroastrian beliefs distanced them from any deep religious interest in the Sanskrit language and classical Hindu texts of the kind that influenced even figures such as Ram Mohan Roy. In his early days in Britain, Naoroji gave lectures that touched on religion, claiming Zoroastrianism was a rational religion, not a primitive faith of fire worship. He was also learned in the Western classics, but as an economist and rationalist, he had very little investment in the classical Indian languages, Arabic or Persian. How did Naoroji use Macaulay's template? In the first place, he picked up and elaborated Macaulay's depiction of the avarice and oppression of the East India Company's early career. Notably, he cited Macaulay to the fact that, quote, "A war of Bengalis against Englishmen was like a war of sheep against wolves, of men against demons." As Macaulay himself stated, the despotism of the company at that period was more oppressive than any Muslim regime in India had ever been. But whereas Macaulay had set against this picture the emerging pattern of reform and progress, culminating ultimately in a free India within the British world, Naoroji was doubtful, to say the least. At the 1886 Calcutta Congress meeting, he threw Macaulay's own words at the British government. Where was this free India? And what of the words of the 1833 Charter to the effect that no native-born inhabitant of the said territories shall by reason of his religion, place of birth, descent, colour, or any of them be disabled from holding any office, place, or employment under the said company. This had been reinforced by the Royal Proclamation of Crown Government in 1858, but the continued exclusion of all but a tiny minority of Indians from the ICS and racist agitation in Britain and India against allowing judicial powers over whites to Indians had violated this trust. Nairoji returned to this theme on many occasions. At the 1906 meeting of the Congress, we find him using Macaulay's strictures of 1832 against the slow pace of development of the franchise in the UK to attack the minimal expansion of the electorates of provincial legislatures introduced by the so-called Morley-Minto reforms of that year. He says, even the peasants of Russia had received the Duma from the greatest autocrat in the world, a reference to the consequences of the 1905 revolution in that country, which would have interested Macaulay. But India still laboured under un-British rule. Another leading moderate nationalist of this period, J.K. Gokhale, who was to bring Gandhi to India, appeared at the National Liberal Club in London lecturing on England's duty to India. He again repeated Macaulay's words that when the ultimate aim of Indian reform was reached with its national independence, this would be the proudest day in English history. But one of the suspicions of the educated nationalist leaders towards the end of the 19th century was that the British were implementing a conservative policy of divide and rule, dividing Hindus from Muslims, Bengalis from other Indians, princely states from the wider population, landowners from peasants. In India, ironically, this colonial ideological shift helped create a new stage of Orientalism and a new interest in classical Indian languages and culture. This was sometimes relatively benign, as in George Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India. The noted Sanskrit scholar Friedrich Max Müller was quoted by the newspaper Native Opinion in 1873, "What I want to see in India is the rising of a national spirit and honest pride in your history, a discriminating love of your ancient literature, but this should not detract from a better national future." In other contexts, however, this return to the classics in education and government policy was regarded with a degree of suspicion as a ploy to halt India's progress. Here Macaulay inevitably embarked on yet another of his afterlives, or perhaps we should say, began to inhabit another of his avatars. A good example of this is provided by the fierce debate about education in the Punjab in the late 1870s and early 1880s, when the Austrian Jewish scholar G.W. Leitner began vigorously to promote Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit at a time when the Punjab University was beginning to take form. Leitner was a brilliant scholar who is said to have mastered 53 languages, and, imitating Richard Burton, he travelled into northwest India and Central Asia in the guise of a native merchant. His treatise on the territory of Dardistan became a classic of Orientalist anthropology. Leitner was one of the founder members of the Anjuman-e-Punjab, an institution designed to promulgate indigenous traditions of scholarship and religion in the province. This was less of a divide and rule initiative, since at least initially, indigenous practitioners of very different sorts attended its meetings, including medical practitioners of both broadly Islamic and Hindu varieties, Veds and Hakims, and ordinance for Sikh priesthoods called Bhais. Leitner and his supporters pushed forward his plan for the reinvigoration of the indigenous languages of the Punjab with extraordinary concentration. He became, in effect, a kind of counter-Macaulay, arguing for the importance of Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit with Macaulay-esque rhetoric. Leitner's tract for the Punjab government, A History of Indigenous Education in the Punjab Since Annexation, published in 1882, gives a flavour of this. He says, "Respect for learning has always been the redeeming feature of the East. The most unscrupulous chief, the avaricious moneylender, and even the freebooter vied with a small landholder in making peace with his conscience by founding schools and rewarding the learned." But the British had changed all this. Unconsciously, no doubt, as we felt safer, we began to think less of the prejudices of the people, and the energies of our best officers were devoted to the introduction on a virgin field of reforms of doubtful success in Europe. The result was the creation of a vulgar language of Urdu, which was in turn aided by those who had a smattering of English, the coveted possession of the class eager for place in political power, which we have created out of the rejected members of the chiefly and middle and lower castes. What was needed was a re-emphasis on the educational virtues of Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit, from which all real learning had been formed. Quote, instead of identifying them with our interest, everything in their literature which appeared ridiculous to our hasty examination, clearly a reference to Macaulay, was held up to tacit scorn, a course which was calculated to destroy the sense of reverence amongst their co-religionists. The result, he says, was a system of so-called English education which Leitner found in the Punjab when he reached there in 1864. This consisted of bits of mathematics, fragments of works on Milton, an essay of Chateaubriand, feeble attempts to teach the history of Greece, Rome, and Italy. What was badly required was a revival of the study of classical languages of India, for true learning and taste amongst the natives of India are still Oriental, not English. Education had to be based on, quote, religion and national foundations. This work gives a sense of how the idealist moment of the late 19th century differed substantially from the rational reform projects of Macaulay's age 50 years earlier. Leitner, however, was not without his critics, and Macaulay reappeared as a weapon in their arsenal. The main opposition was voiced in Punjab's leading Indian English language newspaper, The Tribune, which began publishing in 1880. It was owned by a Sikh modernist, Sardar Ajit Singh Majithia, and edited by Bengali intellectuals who'd come to the Punjab in the wake of the annexation of the 1840s. Its readers appear to have been Bengali Brahmo Samajists, who, as we've seen, provided much of the early support for English education in Bengal itself. But North Indian Arya Samajists, members who professed a rationalist, anti-ritualistic religion, not dissimilar to the Brahmas, were also amongst its early readers. Both groups were favourable towards the Indian National Congress and staged major opposition to the British government towards the end of the century. In 1881, the Tribune accused British officials and missionaries of downgrading high education because they disliked what the newspaper called classical babus, that is, modernized Indian intellectuals, particularly Bengali ones, who sniped at the government. Both missionaries and government were trying to orientalize high education, by which was meant high school and college education. This must be one of the first uses of this word in a pejorative sense, later taken up by Edward Said. Missionaries, the article continued, do not like secular higher education because it appears to make conversion less likely. They raised the cry of mass education to conceal their real object, the withdrawal of government from education, which they thought would give them a better chance to proselytize. Leitner and his worshippers were trying, through the Anjumani Punjab, to create an institution for, quote, the perpetuation of exploded sciences in the form of the Oriental College Lahore. This might seem like a patriotic act, but in fact it was a way of keeping your country free from the invigorating thought of the West and perpetuating Oriental literature for long lying in a state of unhealthy stagnation. Leitner himself was an autocrat, dominating the credulous traditional intellectuals of the indigenous traditions. The whole policy was contrary to Macaulay's noble-minded and philanthropic policy of bringing in the English language and Western thought. It was only small-minded Anglo-Indians who claimed that natives never benefited from Western ideas and science. He says, the article says, it's unusual to find even in the literary circles of the continent, i.e. continental Europe, any foreigner who can express himself in English with as much facility and correctness that we can find in many Hindus. Leitner had also managed to infuriate the Bengali intelligentsia by arguing that Bengal had no indigenous intellectual culture, which is why it had to take up English. The editor of the Tribune lauded classical Bengali literature. By contrast, Urdu was the offshoot of a foreign language and Persian totally alien, he said. These culture wars were ultimately solved by popular demand, not by the battles of intellectuals. Urdu, with a mixture of Persian, remained the literary language of the Punjab. Punjabi remained the local language. The Persian, Gurumukhi, and Hindi scripts subsisted alongside each other until the province was violently partitioned in 1947. English grew increasingly popular at the school and university level and among the elites. Nevertheless, the controversy did contribute in some small way to the increasing tendency of North Indian political leaders to annex language to issues of community identity and so-called communalism. The Tribune accused Leitner and his supporters of trying to revive a kind of Mughal cultural domination in the province. In conclusion, I'll move to the 20th century. Controversies over language were heightened as the British Empire was contested more vigorously and democracy took hold across the subcontinent. Muslim elites were concerned by the British move to give Hindi equal status with Urdu in the United Province in 1901. Congress voted in 1916 for the creation of language-based provinces, but this simply raised the issue of the status of linguistic minorities within them. After independence, a fierce battle raged over the national language. Politicians in the south of the country, where wholly different language forms existed from those in the Sanskritic north, balked at the introduction of Hindi as a national language and supported the case for English as it was what was called a link language. Opposition to Hindi was partly based on aversion to North Indian Brahminic culture as the non-Brahmin movement gained strength, partly also to the devotion to the mother tongue. There were parallels in the Hindi build. Here, zealots for Hindi staged demonstrations and attacked shops which paraded signs in English in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as Hindi was closely associated with populist Hinduism. I vividly remember denunciations of English as a colonial import, this has continued, of course, and attacks on merchants in the city of Allahabad on the river Ganges at this time. I particularly recall the occasion when a shopkeeper I knew, his English signs destroyed by a mob, asked what the time was of one of the leaders of the protest. When shown the time on his watch, the shopkeeper smashed that watch, and it was a very expensive one, with a hammer, shouting, "These numbers in English as well, aren't they?" Closer even to the topic of this lecture, Dalit or untouchable groups have begun to celebrate Lord Macaulay's birthday, convinced by the fact that he helped to release them from Brahminical and high-status domination with and through the English language, the Education Minute, and the Criminal Code. Macaulay, as I noted, had argued that his code would release low castes, as he called them, Shudras, from the inequality enforced on them, as he thought, by the antique laws of Manu. Identity politics takes strange forms. Indeed, as Professor Ramaswamy has shown in her chapter on the appropriation of the image statue of Liberty as a Dalit goddess of English. Indeed, B.R. Ambedkar, the key framer of the Constitution of the Republic of India and leader of the Dalits, who later turned to Buddhism as a reaction to casteism, denounced Gandhi's adored Indian villages as sinks of bigotry and praised the mobility of the cities and the liberating power of English. In brutal contrast, the Taliban leader who wrote to the Pakistani schoolgirl Malala Yousafzai, whom they had shot, damned Macaulay by name. Why do they want to make all human beings English? Because Englishmen are staunch supporters and slaves of the Jews. This was presumably a reference to the Balfour Declaration. Goddess of English and Malala. Many Indian public figures and lawyers now call for major revisions of the criminal code, which is held to have failed to keep up with the times and contains serious anomalies. It's interesting that a recent article in the Indian press along these lines was entitled Manu versus Macaulay. Across the Bay of Bengal, in Malaya and Singapore, Macaulay also continues to make his ghostly appearances. It's easy to overrate the importance of his relatively brief and pugnacious career in India, as several of his biographers have done. The English language was being appropriated and used for the purposes of job hunting and scientific and humanistic information well before he arrived in the subcontinent. John Richard's superbly analyzed Indo-Mughal ecumene was already crumbling. Equally, modern Indian indigenous languages, notably Bengali and Urdu, later Hindi, were evolving as forms of communication independent of the spur of English and the minute. Even in the realms of legal codification, a low and uneven process of creating a coherent Indian common law, Anglo-Mohammedan and Anglo-Hindu law, was well entrained before Macaulay bearded a receptive Lord William Bentinck with his proposals. Yet radical social and ideological change needs icons and demons. The shadow of Macaulay seems destined to hover fitfully over India long after his sonorous phrases and patriotic histories have ceased to stir much interest. I'm told that Delhi elites now speak disparagingly of HMTs, Hindi medium types, at their dinners as the Modi government veers back towards Hindi. And Macaulay remains a ghost at these feasts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bailey, for this very enlightening lecture. And Professor Bailey will take a series of questions or comments. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have a reception downstairs, so you can talk personally with Professor Bailey.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this wonderful talk, very sweeping and interesting. I was wondering about how you think Macaulay would have reacted to the publication of Hobson Jobson, right, the Yule Burner volume, which showed that what Macaulay and others were thinking of as English was already shot through with words from many languages, but especially from Hindustan, right, from India.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the English that he was promoting was already an Indian language.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very good point, and I think it actually works with my argument rather than against it. And I don't know, I think Macaulay would have been deeply angered, but then he would have sat back and thought about it and realized in a way that this was what he was asking for, which was the seeding of Indian language with English, but equally the other way around, the seeding of English with Indian languages or Indian words. So I suspect Hobson Jobson was first published in the 1860s, shortly after his death, wasn't it? 60s, 70s? I think. 80s. Right. By then, of course, you do have a different context, and one wonders what he would have made of the Indian National Congress. I think he would have been hostile to that. But certainly, I think that he was looking for seeding, and whether he would have accepted seeding in the other direction, I don't know.
Okay. It's quite an interesting moment for Chris Bailey to be visiting Duke, because I think it's the past few days we've seen a lot of articles on the death of Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes.
And there was one article in the Times of India. Times of India has run many articles on him in the past few days. There was one which titled Lee Kuan Yew, the Friend of the Tamils. And the Friend of the Tamils, meaning Lee Kuan Yew stood up for multicultural, plural democracy and so on, rationalist, forward-moving. And essentially, many of the tributes have said, this is not ideology, this is pragmatism, rationalism, and this is a state he's built which delivers the goods. Ideology, culture, put aside. And I think this is one aspect of why Lee Kuan Yew has been eulogized by the Chinese, by the Indians, by the Americans, across the board, by the Arabs also. And I think, so your talk on Macaulay comes in this moment of disappointment with nationalism, of having been browbeaten in this brave new world of globalization under American tutelage. But really, whether communism, socialism, this and that, Buddhism, there seems to be, at least in many parts of the world, a certain consensus that we just want governments which work and deliver. And this goes back to your I think world historical comparison in the mid-80s of Macaulay looking towards the Egyptian Tanzimat, Russian reform, world trade between Australia, Singapore, and so on. This is an argument, I guess, which has been going back and forth. And right now, the foot is on strongest on the foot of pragmatism, trade, what works, and so on. So I think in that sense, I appreciate your taking Macaulay out of an England versus India tennis match of who gave what to whom, because this broader view of world trade, this very 19th century progressive view, is in a way back with us. The argument goes back and forth. And I think your emphasis on seeing ideas in context, in their social context, resonates very strongly. My question to you actually is a bit different from this topic. My question to you goes to Macaulay's equal opportunity insults, where he is insulting essentially peoples or languages which dabble in myths and enchanted views of the world. And this is true of biblical criticism as it is of the Eastern religion. So what Edward Said called Orientalism, the true crime was not Orientalism, the true crime was positivism.
What was what?
Positivism.
Yes.
History
yes.
as scientific. And that, I think, is a big issue for us today as historians. Because as historians, history is written in universities by people with standards of evidence which do not have time for mythology and things like that. And what this has done is thrown away, essentially rejected data, all the different kinds of narrative and genre which exist in Persian, Hindu, Arabic, Chinese, and so on. And I think that we are suffering from an inability to incorporate, reuse these rich this rich range of genres in Chinese, Arabic, whatever non-European languages. And that, I think, is a big challenge for history writing. How do we work after the positivism of the 19th century historiography?
Well, I mean, that's I'm sure, a very good point. I mean, first of all, about the trade issue, I think that's very, very significant here. And I do think that Macaulay, although he's been characterized in a different way, was largely concerned with an elite lingua franca across the whole of Asia and linking Asia to Europe, rather than actually attacking Indian languages and Indian culture. Although, of course, he's constantly making very rebarbative remarks about them. I think this is just him. He's just like that. And the other thing, really, about your second point is, of course, this is a period when, going back to England, this is a period when Whig rationalism and positivism is at its height. And really what people like Macaulay in Britain are doing is to attack what they see as the vestiges of the old order, in which they would include a kind of reverence for the monarchy, a reverence for certain types of ceremony, a reverence for a certain type of aristocracy. And I think Macaulay took all those ideas to India and tried to put them in play. I mean, I think it's always important to remember that these colonial officials and others who come to India are there for a very short time. Something like 70% of them at this period died in the first 2 or 3 years. So their knowledge of this society is very small. And so presumably some missionary told him awful things about Lord Krishna or something in his first day or two, and he just picked that up and used it. So I mean, it might have been a rationalist and a positivist, but he wasn't particularly well informed, I would say. And I think that would be true of many of these colonial officials. And I think, you know, your broader point about the use of these notions which go beyond rationalism and beyond positivism is a very good one, because we were talking about that earlier in the week, the need to think seriously about the history of memory, the need to think about the way people understand legend, the irrational, and so on. And I quite agree, and I think that's why that idea that came out of our discussions earlier on about the need to bring anthropology into history once again, and not a very, very rigid type of structural anthropology, but an anthropology, if you like, of sentiment, a kind of Gadamer-like anthropology of sentiment and prejudice, will be a very good way forward. So on the one hand, we can understand Macaulay in his time, his need for a rational trading system. On the other hand, his representation as somebody who is over-positive, over-rationalist is, yeah, we can still see him as a bad figure, as a demon in this respect. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a wonderful lecture, and I thought that the parallels between, wanting to get Hindi as the national language at the first moment after independence remind me that, in the U.S., right after the Declaration of Independence, there was a move in Congress to get Hebrew or French as the national language. And then everybody, John Adams, who was the ambassador at that time and then became the president, rushed back and said, no, 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 England is going to go places, we better stay with English. So that, of course, is very much part of it. And then this second part of how our myths and stories have been collected. There were marvelous collections, at least in Bengali, and I know in Tamil and many other languages, from the 1880s onwards, like Thakurma Jhuli, etc., which is sort of grandmother's bags and all these various stories, which have collected enormous numbers of what we would consider oral histories and the anthropologists' stories. Mostly the conversations about incorporating the other histories don't look at them. They don't get into Bengali. We can actually be bilingual, trilingual. I mean, gentlemen, you mentioned who had 53 languages.
Yes, it's Leitner, yes.
But it's now there's the reason why we know about other vernaculars in India is because they are being published and sponsored through translations in English. Otherwise, I have no way of reading Tamil, and Sumati has no way of reading Bengali. But we can read and know about each other's worlds because of these. So that, too, I suppose, is another footnote to Macaulay.
Thank you. Yes.
Oh, Ramon Roy, and Ramon
yes.
Roy, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, just two things I'd like to take up. Eng Seng mentioned Tamil, and I think one of the interesting things is the way that apparently in Sri Lanka, and there may be Sri Lankan historians here, Sri Lankan sociologists, there's an argument that the use of English by the Tamils was, in fact, a divisive force, particularly up to the riots and destruction of the 1980s and 1990s. And apparently the word kadua, meaning a sword, was used to describe English, that it was a sword. And so this notion of epistemic violence actually occurred in an indigenous society before it was taken up by Humi and people of that sort. So I think there is that argument. I'm not trying to denounce that argument or just to dismiss it at all. And equally, the other thing, which I think comes out of this rather peculiar piece, in my view, I think you've seen it, this How English Ruined Indian Literature, yeah, is making the point that it created hierarchy, that it, in fact, reinforced class. Now, that's absolutely true. I mean, there's no question, as I said right at the end with the Hindi median types being sneered at, that it does, in fact, reinforce class. My only question about that would be what type of linguistic expertise, even in English society or American society or French society, does not, in fact, support and reinforce class. Now, it may be more extreme when it's a foreign language, though it's a foreign indigenized language now. But I think we have to be a bit careful about seeing India as totally different in linguistic terms from other societies.
Thank you for that lecture. The question is, you mentioned Gandhi a couple of times.
Yes.
And so the question is about, I mean, both in the Hind Swaraj and in experiments, he gives some thought to the language question. And I just want to hear a little bit more about, this kind of odd interlocutor that Macaulay ends up having much later on, of course, because, there are the public speeches and there's the printing press that he had, and he's, Indian Opinion is getting published in Hindi and Gujarati and Tamil and English, and one of the experiments in the ashrams were also what to do with the question of English. So I'd just like to hear you say a little bit
Well,
about this.
you can never fit Gandhi into any kind of category, really. I mean, he's so totally idiosyncratic. And in this case, of course, he says somewhere that, that English enslaved us. But then he uses English all the time, and he's really a rather good English speaker and English writer. Equally, he denounces railways, but uses railways all the time. Equally, you know, he's a lawyer and he denounces lawyers. So, I mean, it's extremely difficult to fit Gandhi in place. But I think what Gandhi was trying to do was build a bridge between, if you like, the elite English speakers and the ordinary people. And therefore, he felt obliged to actually denounce English as he denounced lawyers from time to time. So it's really a way of making a popular movement real for people who don't know who don't know English. I think that's what it's all about. And I don't know that, well, Nehru, of course, didn't take that particularly seriously. So it's only one side of the national movement, and I think it's a rather idiosyncratic side.
So thank you very much for all the questions.